Rock and roll. We've all heard the term before and most likely listened to songs associated with this genre of music. When rock is heard, it is easily identifiable to many, even without seeing any image to accompany it. But what is rock and roll exactly? How can it be defined? Where does it come from? And what significant impact has it had on American culture throughout the decades? In order to answer these questions, we should probably start at the decade in which rock appears to have clearly emerged. On the surface, the 1950s appeared to be a time of tranquility and prosperity. Many men had returned from serving in World War II, married, and started their own families. Americans were also earning enough money to not only support their families, but to build or purchase modern homes and supply them with the latest technological marvels like washing machines and new kitchen gadgets. However, there were stark contradictions to this idolized American lifestyle. During the 1950s, there were major concerns in response to the Cold War. Rising racial tensions between white and black Americans were steadily rising, as individuals like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks directly challenged inequality as well. During this period in time, teens began to become more aware of blues music that was primarily created and performed by black artists of the time. It has been theorized that teens were ready for something less bland, more exciting and more in line with their experiences. As interest grew, so did rock and roll music, which directly developed from blues as well as earlier country music. Interestingly, it was not until around the arrival of Elvis Presley on the music scene in 1956 that rock and roll first seemed to be recognized by white Americans. With songs such as Hound Dog, Elvis seemed to capture the mood of many teens that were ready to let loose. Many white, middle-class parents of the 1950s, however, were less thrilled with the rise of rock and roll and their teens' sudden interest in it. The popular opinion of the time appeared to be that rock and roll music encouraged juvenile delinquent behavior in teens. In spite of the fears of parents that rock might lead to juvenile delinquent behavior, rock and roll music would continue to grow, adapt, and evolve in the preceding decade of the 1960s. However, the decade was not without cultural issues, as Martin Luther King Jr. would later be assassinated in 1968. As devastating as this loss may have been to the black community, white Americans similarly experienced a major loss, as then-President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. In addition to these profound losses, Americans were equally faced with the tension surrounding the Vietnam War by the mid-1960s. As with the youth of the 1950s, the new teen generation was also interested in finding music that they could uniquely identify with. In a sense, teens tried to find their own version of Elvis. Likewise, music companies were also looking to find the next Elvis. In early 1964, the American music business was taken entirely by surprise when the new Elvis turned out to be 4 young men from Liverpool. The Beatles. Songs by the Beatles such as I Want to Hold Your Hand may have been reflective of the need for society to feel good and at peace, as opposed to supporting the Vietnam War and its violence. Although some adults did not view the behavior of teens during concerts to be healthy. Motown would also come onto the scene and provide black artists with a greater platform to express themselves to listeners. As the 1960s continued to evolve, rock also shifted to a more psychedelic style, which mirrored the mindset of youth in protesting the Vietnam War by advocating for peace. The 1960s also saw its share of monumental cultural events, such as a man successfully landing on the moon in 1969, and the Civil Rights Movement resulting in black Americans obtaining their equal rights. Artists such as Bob Dylan openly expressed their support of the Civil Rights Movement. Bob Dylan himself famously wrote the song Blowin' in the Wind, which would be performed at a protest. A need to examine and challenge the traditional social norms of the previous decades began to also emerge, especially among teens and young adults. Another means of the counterculture to express their need to challenge social norms was through the clothing that was worn. Environmental awareness began to take root also. As the decade of the 1960s transitioned into the 1970s, many of the social and political issues also followed. Issues such as women's liberation, fair treatment of gays, and the struggle of black individuals to be viewed as equal continued to dominate the social consciousness of Americans. After the conclusion of the 1960s, President Nixon essentially ended the war, and with that, there appeared to be a noticeable change in rock music that followed. Youth of the 1970s began to feel a need to rebel against the former mindset. The music that would develop to replace more hippie, folk, and psychedelic forms of rock would ultimately be less peaceful in nature and embrace the expression of more negative thoughts and feelings not typically expressed in music. Hard rock, heavy metal, and punk would come to dominate the 1970s. David Bowie would famously create his stage persona Ziggy Stardust and perform songs such as Space Oddity. His style challenged gender norms and influenced youth to also challenge those norms. In a sense, David Bowie was believed to be the answer to teens who longed for their own version of Elvis. Although this gender bending may have created interest in the music released by artists like David Bowie, it seems as though Americans were not fully ready to accept androgyny. As the 1980s gave way to more electronic forms of music and pop fusions, female artists continued to carve out their place in rock history. By the conclusion of the 1980s, female performers such as Tina Turner managed to overcome the struggles of the women's movement of the 1960s by becoming a successful artist in her own right. Over the years, Tina would release a multitude of hits. Her song, What's Love Got to Do With It, would go on to cement her as a force to be reckoned with artistically. Ultimately, strength appears to be the common thread that runs between all successful female rock artists and continues to challenge men while providing women with a sense of hope. Tina Turner was significant to the history of rock and roll as she was able to embody these aspects fully for generations of women. As with the previous decades that came before, there were current social and political influences that had an impact on the music that was constructed and released. During the early 90s, several noteworthy events took place. In 1991, Iraq invaded oil-rich Kuwait, and American troops intervened, pushing Iraq's army back. Years later, President Clinton faced backlash for his extramarital indiscretions. Clinton was accused of and finally admitted to having a sexual affair with a White House intern and lying to Congress about it under oath. As the youth of the 1990s entered into their teenage years, they would come to associate the mindset of the 1980s and previous decades with resentment, as many began to realize that the promises of success and happy home lives had not come to fruition for all. A new form of rock and roll emerged from the gritty and cold atmosphere of Seattle, Washington that seemed to address the feelings of youth. This new form of alternative rock and roll would soon come to simply be known as grunge. Groups like Nirvana, led by singer Kurt Cobain, would form and produce music that specifically hit the nerve of youth that felt disillusioned by society. Kurt Cobain seems to have had the most significant impact on grunge prior to his death in 1994, as his music instantly resonated with teens and still continues to have an impact on the youth of today. So why were artists such as Elvis, the Beatles, David Bowie, Tina Turner, and Kurt Cobain able to leave such lasting impressions on culture in spite of being so vastly different in their styles of music? I personally believe that what these artists have in common is their incredible ability to put into words what many listeners cannot. Topics of sex, love, and pain might be difficult for some individuals to share, but through the thunderous sounds and at times risque lyrics of rock and roll, these subjects can be validated and acknowledged. In my opinion, the purpose of rock and roll has been to provide a commentary on current issues of culture, including attitudes, social matters, and even fashion. Ultimately, I view rock and roll as a stylish and auditory time capsule of information that can be enjoyed and discovered at any time by anyone.